Dr. Benson was earlier quoted in a Templeton press release as believing that evidence for the efficacy of intercessory prayer in medicinal settings is mounting. Reassuringly, then, the research was in good hands, unlikely to be spoiled by skeptical vibrations. Dr. Benson and his team monitored 1,802 patients at 6 hospitals, all of whom received coronary bypass surgery. The patients were divided into 3 groups. Group 1 received prayers and didn't know it. Group 2, the control group, received no prayers and didn't know it. Group 3 received prayers and did know it. The comparison between Groups 1 and 2 tests for the efficacy of intercessory prayer. Group 3 tests for possible psychosomatic effects of knowing that one is being prayed for.
Prayers were delivered by the congregations of 3 churches, one in Minnesota, one in Massachusetts, and one in Missouri, all distant from the 3 hospitals. The praying individuals, as explained, were given only the first name and initial letter of the surname of each patient for whom they were to pray. It is good experimental practice to standardize as far as possible, and they were all, accordingly, told to include in their prayers the phrase, "For a successful surgery with a quick, healthy recovery and no complications." The results, reported in the American Heart Journal of April 2006, were clear-cut. There was no difference between those patients who were prayed for and those who were not. What a surprise! There was a difference between those who knew they'd been prayed for and those who did not know one way or the other. But it went in the wrong direction. Those who knew they had been the beneficiaries of prayer suffered significantly more complications than those who did not. Was God doing a bit of smiting to show his disapproval of the whole balmy enterprise? It seems more probable that those patients who knew they were being prayed for suffered additional stress in consequence. Performance anxiety, as the experimenters put it. Dr. Charles Bethia, one of the researchers, said, "It may have made them uncertain, wondering, am I so sick they had to call in their prayer team? In today's litigious society, is it too much to hope that those patients suffering heart complications, as a consequence of knowing they were receiving experimental prayers, might put together a class action lawsuit against the Templeton Foundation?"
It will be no surprise that this study was opposed by theologians, perhaps anxious about its capacity to bring ridicule upon religion. The Oxford theologian Richard Swinburne, writing after the study failed, objected to it on the grounds that God answers prayers only if they are offered up for good reasons. Praying for somebody rather than somebody else, simply because of the fall of the dice in the design of a double-blind experiment, does not constitute a good reason. God would see through it. That indeed was the point of my Bob Newhart satire, and Swinburne is right to make it too. But in other parts of his paper, Swinburne himself is beyond satire. Not for the first time, he seeks to justify suffering in a world run by God.
My suffering provides me with the opportunity to show courage and patience. It provides you with the opportunity to show sympathy and to help alleviate my suffering. And it provides society with the opportunity to choose whether or not to invest a lot of money in trying to find a cure for this or that particular kind of suffering. Although a good God regrets our suffering, his greatest concern is surely that each of us shall show patience, sympathy, and generosity, and, thereby, form a holy character. Some people badly need to be ill for their own sake, and some people badly need to be ill to provide important choices for others. Only in that way can some people be encouraged to make serious choices about the sort of person they are to be. For other people, illness is not so valuable.
This grotesque piece of reasoning, so damningly typical of the theological mind, reminds me of an occasion when I was on a television panel with Swinburne, and also with our Oxford colleague, Professor Peter Atkins. Swinburne at one point attempted to justify the Holocaust, on the grounds that it gave the Jews a wonderful opportunity to be courageous and noble. Peter Atkins splendidly growled, "May you rot in hell."
Another typical piece of theological reasoning occurs further along in Swinburne's article. He rightly suggests that if God wanted to demonstrate his own existence, he would find better ways to do it than slightly biasing the recovery statistics of experimental versus control groups of heart patients. If God existed and wanted to convince us of it, he would fill the world with super miracles. But then Swinburne lets fall his gem.
There is quite a lot of evidence anyway of God's existence, and too much might not be good for us.
Too much might not be good for us. Read it again. Too much evidence might not be good for us. Richard Swinburne is the recently retired holder of one of Britain's most prestigious professorships of theology and is a Fellow of the British Academy. If it's a theologian you want, they don't come much more distinguished. Perhaps you don't want a theologian.
Swinburne wasn't the only theologian to disown the study after it had failed. The Reverend Raymond J. Lawrence was granted a generous tranche of op-ed space in the New York Times to explain why responsible religious leaders will breathe a sigh of relief that no evidence could be found of intercessory prayer having any effect. Would he have sung a different tune if the Benson study had succeeded in demonstrating the power of prayer? Maybe not, but you can be certain that plenty of other pastors and theologians would. The Reverend Lawrence's piece is chiefly memorable for the following revelation.
Recently, a colleague told me about a devout, well-educated woman who accused a doctor of malpractice in his treatment of her husband. During her husband's dying days, she charged, the doctor had failed to pray for him.
Other theologians joined Noma-inspired skeptics in contending that studying prayer in this way is a waste of money because supernatural influences are by definition beyond the reach of science. But, as the Templeton Foundation correctly recognized when it financed the study, the alleged power of intercessory prayer is, at least in principle, within the reach of science. A double-blind experiment can be done and was done. It could have yielded a positive result, and if it had, can you imagine that a single religious apologist would have dismissed it on the grounds that scientific research has no bearing on religious matters? Of course not. Needless to say, the negative results of the experiment will not shake the faithful. Bob Barth, the spiritual director of the Missouri prayer ministry, which supplies some of the experimental prayers, said,
A person of faith would say that this study is interesting, but we've been praying a long time, and we've seen prayer work. We know it works, and the research on prayer and spirituality is just getting started.
Yeah, right, we know from our faith that prayer works. So if evidence fails to show it, we'll just soldier on until finally we get the result we want. The Neville Chamberlain School of Evolutionists. A possible ulterior motive for those scientists who insist on NOMA, the invulnerability to science of the God hypothesis, is a peculiarly American political agenda provoked by the threat of populist creationism. In parts of the United States, science is under attack from a well-organized, politically well-connected, and above all well-financed opposition, and the teaching of evolution is in the front-line trench. Scientists could be forgiven for feeling threatened, because most research money comes ultimately from government, and elected representatives have to answer to the ignorant and prejudiced as well as to the well-informed among their constituents. In response to such threats, an evolution defense lobby has sprung up, most notably represented by the National Center for Science Education, NCSE, led by Eugenie Scott, indefatigable activist on behalf of science, who has recently produced her own book, Evolution versus Creationism. One of NCSE's main political objectives is to court and mobilize sensible religious opinion, mainstream churchmen and women who have no problem with evolution and may regard it as irrelevant to, or even in some strange way supportive of, their faith. It is to this mainstream of clergy, theologians, and non-fundamentalist believers, embarrassed as they are by creationism because it brings religion into disrepute, that the evolution defense lobby tries to appeal.